Brothers and sisters, listen closely. What you are about to hear is not the sound of gunfire, nor the rumble of tanks rolling across a desert road. It is something far more profound, the sound of a continent shifting beneath its feet. It is the roar of dignity rising from the red dust of Ouagadougou. For generations, we were told that Africa's security must be signed, sealed, and delivered by foreign hands. We were told that protection was something rented, not owned, that strength was a gift, not a birthright. But on one ordinary morning, in one landlocked nation long dismissed as powerless, that lie was detonated without a single shot being fired. This is not a story about weapons. This is a story about will, about a people who decided that sovereignty is not something you ask for, but something you build with your own hands. And as the sun rose over the Sahel, a new chapter in the struggle for self-determination began. Before we go deeper, I ask you, if you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, then press subscribe, share this message, and walk this road with me until the very end. Let me take you back, not decades, but just a few sunrises ago, to a morning when the earth beneath Africa's feet shifted forever. It was the 10th day of October in the year 2025. The air in Ouagadougou was heavy with the scent of dry earth and anticipation. On streets once lined with rusted trucks and borrowed rifles, something extraordinary was happening. They came not with the noise of conquest, but with the solemn weight of history. Convoys of steel giants rolled into the Burkina Faso capital. Tanks with their hulls gleaming in the harsh Sahel sun, multi-launch rocket systems resting silent but ready, air defense units standing tall like sentinels reborn. This was no parade for foreign dignitaries. No banner waved the flag of another empire. This was an army receiving its armor, not leased, not loaned, not donated with strings wrapped tightly around every bullet, but owned, outright and undeniable. And in that moment, beneath the shadow of those machines, an old story died. For generations, Africa's armies were built like rental cars, driven by others, returned damaged, and always dependent. We remember the images, foreign officers signing off on every mission, spare parts shipped from European ports when weapons failed, reports written in colonial tongues before help could be dispatched. Security, they told us, was a service, one you must pay for with obedience. And for too long, nations like Burkina Faso accepted that script. But on that morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré tore that script to shreds. He did not arrive in a limousine flanked by foreign advisors. He did not speak the language of compromise or apology. He walked on foot among his soldiers, bare-handed, unguarded, a man not above them but beside them. And when he spoke, the words were not many, but they fell heavy, like iron striking stone. We defend what is ours, and we depend on no one to do it for us. It was more than a declaration. It was a reckoning. With history, with humiliation, with the belief that African nations must forever wait for permission to stand tall. The crowd gathered there felt it too. Old men who had once fought under foreign command wept openly. Young recruits, born long after colonial flags were lowered, stood straighter than they ever had. This was not just a transfer of weapons. It was a transfer of identity. The symbolism cut deeper than the steel itself. Every tank rolling off those trucks was a rejection of dependency. Every rocket launcher was an answer to the question, what does sovereignty look like in the 21st century? And as the engines rumbled, their sound was not just mechanical. It was spiritual. It was the echo of a continent saying, no more. Because for the first time in modern West African history, a nation under siege was no longer looking outward for salvation. It was looking inward, building the capacity to fight and to win on its own terms. No more waiting for rescue planes from Paris. No more emergency deployments from Washington. No more patrols that required signatures from someone in a foreign capital. The Burkina Faso army now carried the authority of its own will. And do not misunderstand, this was not merely about weapons. It was about who controls the trigger. A rifle owned is a choice reclaimed. A tank purchased is a policy rewritten. This was about ownership, and ownership changes everything. From that day, the paradigm began to shift. Diplomats in Paris stopped speaking so confidently. Analysts in Washington stopped writing so smugly. Because they understood the deeper message behind those armored columns, Africa has stopped asking for permission to protect itself. And once a people stop asking, they never start again. For our elders watching this story unfold, it carried a familiar resonance. You remember the marches, the boycotts, the speeches that thundered against injustice. You remember the moment when a people decided they would no longer ask for civil rights. They would claim them. What happened in Ouagadougou is born of that same spirit. Different soil, same soul. This was a moment of rupture, not with war, but with weakness. A moment that whispered across the sands of the Sahel, we are no longer clients. We are custodians of our destiny. But brothers and sisters, a ceremony, however grand, does not make a revolution. The real question remains unanswered. Because what we saw that morning was the beginning of something, not its fulfillment. If this was the dawn of a new chapter, what hidden struggles, bold decisions, and quiet battles lay behind it? How did a small, landlocked nation, written off as fragile, summon the will and the means to challenge a global order built to keep it kneeling? You see, brothers and sisters, the tanks and rockets were never the full story. They were the fruit, but the root was deeper, older, and more deliberate. What unfolded in that October sun was not the miracle of a single morning, but the harvest of years spent unlearning dependence and rewriting the script handed down by foreign powers. Captain Traoré understood something most of his predecessors did not. A chain is not broken by protest alone. It is broken by replacing every link with something of your own making. And so he began, quietly, patiently, strategically. The first target was the illusion of generosity. For decades, Western governments spoke of aid as though it were a gift. But each rifle donated came with a policy attached. Each training mission arrived with a diplomat's signature required before a single patrol could move. This was not partnership. It was a leash. And so the young head of state took a bold step. He stopped taking their weapons. Instead, funds once used to host foreign missions, their convoys, their consultants, their endless capacity-building workshops, were redirected into Burkina Faso training schools and domestic supply chains. Engineers began crafting spare parts at home. Logistics officers designed new systems without waiting for instruction. The principle was painfully simple. A nation that pays for its own bullets decides when to shoot. Then came the economic maneuver that left Western analysts stunned. Rather than begging for more assistance, Burkina Faso rewrote its trade map. Gold, cotton, and agricultural products flowed not toward Europe, but toward partners in Asia and the Middle East. No longer were they exchanged for lectures on governance. They were traded for the tools of sovereignty. And the revenue, once swallowed by consultancy fees and luxury imports, was rerouted directly into the defense budget. With these funds, the country could suddenly afford the powerful Ninko VN-22BS vehicles and SR-5 rocket systems without touching a single IMF loan. This was not a plea for help. It was a declaration of independence, inked in trade agreements rather than treaties. But weapons, as Traoré knew, are useless if wielded by minds still waiting for permission. Dependency was not just material, it was psychological. Western advisors had drilled into African officers the doctrine of coordination, a polite way of saying, wait for our orders. That mindset had cost lives, and so the new doctrine was carved into the heart of the Burkina Faso army. Initiative saves lives. Hesitation kills faster than bullets. Local commanders began planning operations based on ground intelligence rather than foreign satellite feeds. Patrols were launched on the judgment of local officers, men and women who knew the terrain, the language, the enemy. And the results were immediate. Insurgent strongholds that had stood for years crumbled under coordinated assaults. The difference was not the weaponry, it was the will. This transformation, of course, did not go unnoticed. In Western capitals, alarm bells rang. Offers of technical assistance arrived with diplomatic smiles, thinly veiled attempts to regain influence. They were politely refused. Meetings were requested. Invitations were declined. Captain Traoré did not insult them. He simply made them irrelevant. And here, my elders, is where the hypocrisy deepened. As long as African soldiers fought and died under foreign command, they were called partners. But the moment they stood on their own, they were called threats. Media outlets that had ignored Burkina Faso for years suddenly rediscovered its name, accusing its government of authoritarianism, militarization, and destabilization. It was not the weapons that frightened them. It was the independence. One headline, buried deep in a Western outlet, tried to explain what was happening. According to recent Ibrahim Traoré news reports, a seismic shift is underway, one that challenges the very foundation of Africa's post-colonial order. They were right. It was seismic. But it was also overdue. Because this story, elders, is one you know too well. You've seen it on the streets of Montgomery, in the marches of Selma, in the classrooms of Little Rock. They called you agitators when you stood on your own. They called you radicals when you refused to obey. And yet history now calls you pioneers. The struggle of a people for self-determination, whether in Alabama or Ouagadougou, is written in the same ink. But even as Burkina Faso dismantled the chains of dependency, another question loomed. Power built at home still had to face the world beyond its borders. Would the old powers accept this new reality, or would they attempt to reshape it? Would they step back gracefully, or would they conspire to pull the leash tight once more? And so, the stage was set. But the battle had only just begun. Because the consequences of this defiance, at home, abroad, and on the battlefield, would ripple far beyond the Sahel. And the world's response would reveal what freedom truly costs. Brothers and sisters, when a people change their mindset, the consequences reach far beyond the battlefield. The shift that began in Ouagadougou was not a ripple. It was a wave crashing into every corner of national life. And in its wake, a new kind of nation began to take shape, not merely defended, but defined by its own strength. The first transformation was visible not in the skies or on the front lines, but in the workshops and classrooms scattered across Burkina Faso. What once were dusty barracks became living laboratories. Mechanics, engineers, and welders now stood shoulder to shoulder with riflemen, learning not just how to operate imported machines, but how to maintain them, improve them, and, one day, build them. Every engine that hummed beneath a soldier's hand was no longer a mystery from a distant factory. It was a lesson, a skill, a seed of sovereignty planted in the soil of everyday life. In these humble places, a doctrine of independence was being forged, one bolt, one circuit, one piece of steel at a time. A generation that had once been told its destiny was to receive was now being taught how to create. And with that shift came a deeper truth. The power to defend a nation does not rest solely in the hands of its soldiers. It resides in the minds of its people. The change extended beyond the barracks. Across the countryside, soldiers no longer waited for foreign supply drops to feed their units. They planted their own crops. They harvested their own food. The uniforms they wore were cut and sewn in local workshops. The vehicles they drove were maintained by Burkinabe hands. A force once defined by dependency was now sustained by its own labor. And with each field tilled and each machine repaired, the invisible threads of sovereignty grew stronger. Even the rhythm of daily life along the borders began to change. Villages once terrorized by insurgents found safety in the presence of local patrols who no longer needed permission to act. Roads once avoided after sunset now carried traders and farmers home. Markets reopened where fear had once kept shutters closed. In the hum of commerce and the laughter of children returning to school, the dividends of independence were counted not in money, but in peace. And yet, my elders, this transformation was not without cost. It demanded sacrifice. Funds that once paid for imported luxuries were redirected into defense. Comfort gave way to commitment. Mistakes were made, parts failed, supply lines stumbled, operations misfired. But these were the growing pains of a nation learning to walk on its own legs. And as any parent knows, a child's first steps are not perfect, but they are precious, because they are theirs. More importantly, a new generation of commanders was rising, men and women who did not graduate from Western academies but from the school of their own soil. They spoke the language of their people, understood the terrain beneath their feet, and measured victory not by foreign applause but by the safety of their communities. They were not simply military officers. They were the heirs to a doctrine that refused to fear failure more than it feared submission. And what shook foreign observers most was not the weaponry or the tactics. It was the faith. Faith that Africa's defense no longer required external validation. Faith that loyalty to one's homeland was not measured in aid received, but in sacrifices made. Faith that a nation standing on its own, however imperfectly, stood taller than one leaning forever on another's shoulder. This is the true cost and the true reward of self-reliance. The cost is responsibility. The reward is dignity. And as Burkina Faso embraced both, it found something more powerful than any arsenal: self-respect. Once a people possess that, they cannot be ruled the same way again. Now, my brothers and sisters, I must ask you, those who have lived through struggle and survival, those who have seen promises broken and victories hard won, if dignity carries a cost, which would you rather pay again? The price of dependency or the price of delay? Because this is the question every African nation must now answer. And the answer will define not just their security, but their soul. But the story does not end at the border. Because as Burkina Faso rebuilt its house, the neighbors were watching, and so were the giants beyond the sea. Their silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. And the reactions brewing in Washington, Paris, and London would reveal just how threatened the old order truly was. Now, elders, let us lift our eyes beyond the borders of one nation and see how the winds of change have begun to shake the foundations of power far away, across oceans, in glass-walled conference rooms and marble-lined war rooms. Because what began as a local act of defiance has now become a global reckoning. In Washington, the silence was deafening. Defense planners who once charted every detail of African operations are now watching their maps grow blank. The drone bases that dotted the Sahel, once symbols of control, are shrinking in size and scope. Missions that once required foreign signatures are now conducted without a single phone call to a Western capital. And with every independent patrol, the message grows louder. The continent, once seen as a dependent frontier, is learning to speak for itself. It is not just the loss of bases that rattles the halls of power. It is the loss of leverage. For decades, the unspoken deal was simple: we protect, you obey. But that transaction is collapsing. As new alliances take shape and local command structures solidify, the old guarantee of obedience is gone. Policymakers who dismissed African agency as impossible now face a question they never prepared for. How do you negotiate with a continent that no longer needs you? Across the Atlantic, in Paris, the humiliation cuts even deeper. France, the old colonial master, the self-appointed guardian of Sahel security, is now witnessing its last outposts transform into monuments of a bygone era. Expelled from Mali, rejected in Niger, and increasingly irrelevant in Burkina Faso, its role as Africa's overseer is fading into history. Every armored vehicle that rolls through Ouagadougou without a French flag is a reminder that the age of dependency is ending, and nothing frightens a former empire more than irrelevance. Even the narratives are collapsing. For years, Western media described the Sahel as an ungovernable zone, a justification for military intervention and policy dominance. But now, with the rise of local coalitions like the Alliance of Sahel States, with joint intelligence networks and resource protection initiatives growing stronger by the day, that story no longer holds. If Africa can defend itself, if it can coordinate, cooperate, and command, then the question becomes, what exactly is the West's role? Even the press cannot hide the truth forever. One quiet headline buried in international coverage admitted the shift. According to recent Burkina Faso news reports, Africa's security architecture is being rewritten, and not by foreign hands. They did not shout it, because shouting would mean admitting defeat. But they whispered it, and that whisper is spreading. And so, in this new reality, the old powers stand before a choice. They can adapt, meeting Africa eye to eye, treaty to treaty, respecting sovereignty as equal to their own. Or they can retreat, clinging to outdated narratives while the world moves on without them. But one thing they can no longer do is pretend that nothing has changed. Because the storm unleashed by one small nation is no longer contained. The tide of self-determination is rising, and the question is no longer whether the old order will fall, but what new destiny Africa will choose to build in its place. Brothers and sisters, revolutions do not end with parades. They do not end with speeches or ceremonies or even victories. They only truly begin when the dust settles, when the banners are folded and the question shifts from, what did we break, to, what will we build? And that is precisely where Burkina Faso now stands. The road ahead is neither straight nor smooth. It is not a path paved with instant prosperity or guaranteed success. It is a road carved with sweat, sharpened by sacrifice, and built by hands that refuse to let go of their tools. To stay on this course, the nation must nurture the very roots of its newfound independence. First, it must strengthen its domestic industry, the quiet, often overlooked engine of sovereignty. The factories that produce spare parts, the workshops that assemble uniforms, the farms that feed the soldiers, these are as essential to defense as any tank or missile. A nation that cannot sustain its own supply chain is still vulnerable to the pressure of those who can. Second, the next generation of officers must be more than warriors. They must be scholars, engineers, diplomats, thinkers capable of reading both the battlefield and the balance sheet. Investment in military academies, technical institutes, and leadership schools will ensure that the doctrine of self-reliance does not die with the generation that birthed it. It must evolve, mature, and endure. Third, cooperation must be redefined. Partnership is not a dirty word, as long as it is voluntary, balanced, and time-bound. The new relationships Burkina Faso builds with allies in Africa, Asia, and beyond should be rooted in skill sharing and mutual respect, not supervision. Each treaty must be a handshake, not a handcuff. Fourth, sovereignty must flow beyond the barracks and into the streets. Veterans must transition into industries that strengthen the civilian economy. Barracks must become centers of innovation, training, and entrepreneurship. The fruits of independence must feed not only the soldier on the front line, but also the family in the marketplace and the student in the classroom. And finally, the wisdom of the elders, the very generation who fought, prayed, and endured through darker times, must not be lost. Your memories are the map. Your lessons are the compass. The fight for dignity is not new, it simply wears new armor. Just as your marches reshaped America's conscience, so too can Africa's stand reshape the world's balance. The road ahead is long. Mistakes will be made. Setbacks will occur, but a journey walked with dignity, however difficult, is worth far more than a road traveled in chains. And if Burkina Faso holds its course, if it feeds its army, educates its officers, and builds partnerships on its own terms, then its example will light the way for a continent still searching for its full strength. But this is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is Africa's. It is ours. And the question now is this: when the next storm comes, as storms always do, will the engines of sovereignty still roar, or will they falter? The answer will define not just the future of one nation, but the destiny of an entire continent. Brothers and sisters, we have walked a long road together in this story. From the roar of tanks rolling into Ouagadougou to the quiet strength of a nation learning to stand without permission. And if there is one truth this journey has revealed, it is this: dignity is not given. It is built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, heartbeat by heartbeat. What began as a spark in one small country has now become a beacon across the continent. It is more than politics. It is more than defense. It is the rebirth of a people's belief in themselves, the realization that the strength they were told must come from outside has always lived within. And as the doctrine of sovereignty takes root, the map of Africa itself is being redrawn, not by colonial pens in foreign capitals, but by African hands in African soil. This is why Ibrahim Traoré news is not just a headline. It is a testimony that even the most underestimated nations can rise when they stop asking for permission to exist. It is a reminder that Africa's story is still being written, and this time it is being written by those who once were written about. But this is not the end. The question now belongs to all of us, here and across the diaspora. Will we watch from afar as history unfolds, or will we add our voices, our wisdom, and our strength to the rising chorus of self-determination? Will we let the story of Burkina Faso news be a single chapter, or the opening of a new book written by many hands? The next generation is watching. They are listening for the echoes of our courage. And what we say, how we support, how we remember, how we act, will shape the world they inherit. So I ask you, what does real independence mean to you? What would you build if the chains of dependency were finally broken? If this message stirred your spirit, do not let it end here. Subscribe, share this story, and speak your truth in the comments below. Let them hear that you were here when a new Africa began to rise, and that you believed, as we all must, that the best chapters of Ibrahim Traoré news are still yet to be written.